This movie is about relative references. It involves formulas, copying and cutting and pasting, both the formulas and the references. So we're going to copy a formula, and then we're going to copy the reference, and then we're going to move that same formula, and then we're going to move the reference so that we can see the impact of all of those adjustments on our worksheet. Relative references. Relative references have to do with the references made within a formula. And I've got a schedule set up where I have two formulas, one here in C9, pressing F2 to visually display that C9 references cell C6. So that's the referenced cell. The other formula I have is in C20, pressing F2. It's a sum function that references the range C15 to D17. So the first thing I'm going to do, escape out of that, is to select my formula that's in C9 and copy it to G9. Control C, arrowing over 4 times and entering. I've copied the formula, and pressing F2, we see that the reference has not changed. The relative position of the cell that's being referenced by the formula is 3 cells above the cell that contains the formula. Over here, it was C6 when I moved it. Here, it's now G6. The relative position of the reference is the same. And the same thing will happen when I move the other formula, the one that's in C20, Control C, moving over 4 spaces and entering F2. The relative position of the range referenced by the formula is the same. The structure of the way that looks is exactly the same as that. There's no content, so the formula is not being updated, but the range that's being referenced is, relatively speaking, in the same position in C20 as it is in G20. So the next thing I'm going to do is copy the referenced cell. I'm going to escape out of that, select C6, Control C, move over 4 spaces and enter. And what happens is probably what you would guess would happen, is that since the new reference is looking to G6 for a value, when we put a value in G6, the formula is updated. The same thing happens with the range. Control C, enter. I'm now going to move the formula. Instead of copying and pasting, after selecting it, I'm going to cut and paste. Control X to cut, move over 4 spaces, enter, F2. The reference is unchanged. And the reference is unchanged because I moved the formula. I cut and pasted the formula. And when you do that, the formula stays intact. Whatever the formula was is still what it is. Nothing changes about the formula. And of course, the same thing is true if the formula contains a range. Control X, over 4, enter. The formula is exactly as it was before. But to further illustrate the relative nature of copying and pasting, I'm going to select K9, display that it is referencing cell G6, which is 3 cells up and 4 cells to the left. I'm going to Control C, 1, 2, 3, 4, enter, F2 again, and the relative position of the formula and the reference is exactly the same, just to re-illustrate what happens when you copy and paste. And I'll do the same thing in K20, F2 to illustrate our starting point. Control C, over 4 spaces, enter, and again the relative nature of the formula and the reference is the same. So now what happens when we cut and paste? We move the content of the cell being referenced. So we have a formula in K9. It's referencing the content in G6. I'm going to select G6, Control X, over 4, enter, and the formula has been updated. Even though it's a relative reference, if you move the content, you cut and paste the content and move it someplace else, the formula will follow that content to its destination. I hope that isn't confusing, because this is a relative reference, and some might think that if you're cutting and pasting and moving the cell being referenced, that it wouldn't affect the relative reference, because the relative reference maintains its position relative to the cell that contains the formula. And that's true up until the point where you move the content that's being referenced to a new location, like we just did. To illustrate that one more time, I'm going to select K20, F2. Our content is in G15 to G17. I'm going to select that range, Control X to move it, and to paste it, I'll enter, arrowing down. The formula has been updated because I moved the content to a new location, and the formula follows that content wherever I put it. So this movie illustrated a couple of points. We can copy a formula, and if that formula has a relative reference, the positioning between the cell containing the formula and the references within the formula remain the same. If the reference is 3 cells above the cell containing the formula, and you copy it, the reference will still be 3 cells above the cell containing the formula. If we move the formula, we cut and paste the formula, you lift the entire formula up and put it in a new location, and it is unchanged. So whatever cell was being referenced to start with, that cell will continue to be referenced in the new location for the formula. If you copy and paste the contents of the cell being referenced, nothing happens with the formula. All you're doing is copying content from one cell to another. If instead you cut and paste the contents of the cell being referenced, that formula will follow that contents around to its destination.